Hi, this is Aviva and Akko, and it's about 8 a.m. Jerusalem time now. I finally got done watching the interview that Tucker Carlson did with Vladimir Putin, and I wrote a lot of notes and paused it many times and tried to get through most of it with the captions before they disappeared. I just didn't want to reload it to start over again. It was taking so long as it was. In any event, this is the first time I've tried to do any kind of talking video. I do have a degree in political science from UC Berkeley. You can check that out. I don't use it very often, but all this stuff is very interesting to me because my father himself came from Poland to Chicago in the 1920s, so about 100 years ago. He was 52, I think, when I was born. My mother was in her 40s, 41, I think. And they met in Chicago. There were a lot of Polish refugees there. My father was a Holocaust orphan, meaning his parents and most of his siblings were murdered by who knows who in Poland, or what might have been Ukraine at the time, southern Poland, Częstochowa, in World War II, and he escaped as the youngest of 11 children to join his two brothers and his sister in Chicago, where he met my mother. And they married in 1942, and I was born 16 years later. I'm an only child, so I have no siblings. If this video can make its way to the surviving cousins, and I don't know them, but they're interested. There are some in Chicago. Just DM me or tweet or get in touch somehow. I don't use telephones, so it's not a very good way to get in touch. But my contact information is on X, and it's on LinkedIn, and it's on Facebook, and you can Google me, and I've been on the internet since forever, since the 1980s. Anyway, this is about the interview, not about me, but that's the background of why I'm interested. My mother's family were from what Putin was talking about, the Polish-Lithuanian what's-its that existed prior to the World Wars, probably prior to World War I, so because they were born before World War I. I never met them. I met my mother's mother once when I was a baby. I have a picture somewhere, maybe. I vaguely remember a little tiny woman with piercing brown eyes who looked like a little crow, and she was sitting very hunched over in her little chair, and she didn't speak any English, and that's all I remember. There's no videos. There weren't any video cameras in those days. I was born in 1958 in Canoga Park. And so my parents, I guess they spoke English and Yiddish at home. I never learned Yiddish. They used to speak Yiddish when they didn't want me to understand what was going on. And the Yiddish that they spoke was sort of a melange of different languages, primarily German, but also some Hebrew words and some Russian words. And so I've had an interest in languages all my life, and I also have a weird hearing impairment, so it's hard for me to use telephones. To watch this interview, I had the closed captions on, and I paused it like 100 times to write notes, and I probably still missed stuff. You could correct me, I'm sure I missed something, and I might have twisted some stuff around, but I wanted to make the video before I forget what he said, so. I thought it was a great interview. I thought it was an interview of a lifetime. I don't remember seeing a better journalist do a better, more objective, impromptu interview. It certainly didn't seem edited to me, but who knows. They're both very good speakers. So, I mean, I've been watching Tucker for since he left Fox, or well, I think it was a little before he left Fox. And I'm not really interested in anybody else on Fox, to tell you the truth. I've been watching Putin for a few years, but I've never seen anything this long with a translation in English. He's often quoted on RT, but it's much more interesting to see his face while he's talking. Okay, so I have quite a few. I'm trying to figure out where I started here. So yes, for the first 30 minutes or so, Vladimir Putin goes into a lengthy history of the country of Russia, that it's been around for 1,000 years. They just celebrated their 1,000th year anniversary. And talks about, well, where I got interested, it was where he was talking about the Bolsheviks and Poland cooperating with the Nazis, because that's why my father's family left, and that's also why my mother's family left. And they were practicing Jews at the time, and this is over 100 years ago. I don't know when my grandparents were born, sometime in the middle of the 19th century, so, because my father was born in 1903. My mother was born in 1917, and I was born in 1958. So the history that Putin was referring to when he was talking about the Bolshevik Revolution and Poland cooperating with the Nazis in World War II is something my parents lived through and my grandparents lived through. And that's why they immigrated to the United States, because they didn't have freedom to practice their religion. They were Orthodox Jews, but there was something like a racial cleansing or a genocide going on even at that time, according to my understanding. There wasn't any fairness, and they were basically terrorizing the Jewish villages, seizing the Jewish businesses. My father's father was a baker. There was a bakery in Częstochowa. One of my cousins, who's long passed away, went and visited it and took pictures of it. And I saw photos of it. I don't have the photos. I don't know who does. But that's what happened. And it started happening. I think they were Cossacks. I don't know the whole story, and that's why I'm interested in it now. I don't have a lot of demands on my time, and I am disabled. So when I have the chance to read up on stuff, it often kind of goes back to my own personal history and finding out who I am and who my parents were and who their parents were, because I don't have records. Or the ones I do have basically start with World War II as far as paper. I have very, very little. So Putin was saying that the Ukraine is an artificially created entity that the Austrians created together with their allies, and later on the USSR, namely Lenin and Stalin, wanted to maintain this as a separate entity, a separate nation, and that ethnically and nationally and linguistically they are Russian, that culturally and there's no distinction that Russia or Putin is making about Ukrainians as being a separate people. He's saying they do that themselves, and it was something that began with the Austrians and later with the Stalinists and the communists basically wanted to keep them as a separate entity, separate from the Russians. And it reminded me a little of the Palestinian issue, which is becoming hotter and hotter every day, and affects me directly because I live near the Lebanese border, that it is an entity created sort of by other entities that needed a kind of buffer zone for their own political reasons, and kind of engineered a group of people into being separate and apart from their neighbors when they basically spoke the same language, they looked the same, they ate the same stuff, they had the same personal interests perhaps, and all of this is kind of an artificial construct. I think that's what he was getting to. Then he was talking about Yeltsin and the bombing of Belgrade. Wasn't around for that, but he was saying that that was the collective Western response to Yeltsin trying to make a rapprochement of sorts with the West, between the East and West, and that was the answer to that. He also says the USA was supporting the North Caucasus national interests in, I think he's referring to Georgia. When I was in Tbilisi in 2017, there was a cab driver, little guy, probably about my age maybe. I'm 65 now, so I was in my 50s. Then he was in his 50s. A lot of older guys drive cabs, even in Israel, and so he was Georgian, and he had fought in that area. And I don't know if he was fighting as a conscript or as a younger man, or if he was just caught in the action as a cab driver. But he said they were shooting at him, and they were Russian soldiers, and he wasn't aware of any kind of aggression initiated by Georgians against the Russians. And so locally, I got the impression that the Georgians don't particularly like the Russians. They are afraid of them. They're afraid of being controlled by Russians. They have their own language. They have their own national identity, and that Russia was sort of trying to squish them and control them and censor them. And Putin is basically saying this is a Western, collective West kind of, he didn't use the word conspiracy, but effort to encourage the nationalists to stir up the nationalist excitement and stir up the shit on the border, on the northern border between Russia and Georgia, and otherwise they would have gotten along just fine. I don't know one way or the other whether that's true, but what came to mind was this memory about a little conversation I had in the taxi that day. And there was also those conversations I had with the kids in the American embassy that came to learn English and practice their English. They said they were concerned about getting the truth from media. And this is kind of funny because they were junior high school kids that told me this. They were afraid that the news was being censored by the Russians, and they weren't hearing the whole truth. And the embassy had CNN on all the time, and I asked them to turn it off because I couldn't hear, which is the truth. But it was funny because Putin says that the media is controlled by the West, by the collective West, and it's very hard to win any media wars or propaganda wars. And of course, this is exactly what we say about the Russians, that RT controls everything, and it's all Russian propaganda. And so it's a war of words, believe what you want. Let's see. Tucker asked Putin about would it make any difference if somebody else was in charge? Would we be able to get a peace agreement faster? Putin said it's not about personalities. He met with Bush Sr. and with Trump and got along with both of them. He's talked about a missile treaty, and he specifically mentioned Condoleezza Rice and Bush. I think he means Bush Jr. And he was talking about the head of the CIA, and he was talking about Gates, and I don't know which Gates he's referring to. Burns is the head of the CIA, and he said that they're in charge of deciding whether they want to revisit some kind of anti-ballistic missile non-aggression pact, because they left it where it was, apparently, and it's sort of stalemated. He didn't use the word stalemated, but it didn't go anywhere, and it's up to them to rekindle it, is what I got out of that. He mentioned NATO expansion to the east as being a big deal to Russia, that's threatening Russia's safety, and it was not something that was agreed to. He talked about 2008 Bucharest, Said Bush exerted pressure on Russia, told Putin to get lost, basically, after Putin suggested that they have this global strategic agreement to secure the region in terms of development of ICBMs, and there wasn't any agreement. And so basically he's saying this group, Rice, Gates, again, I don't know which Gates he's talking about, and Bush said, do whatever you want as long as you don't come after us. I don't know one way or the other. That's what he said. U.S. Presidents Clinton and Bush offered peaceful solutions, and they were undercut by other parties. And so he didn't say what other parties. And in the meantime, Russia has developed hypersonic ICBMs. He did say, which I thought was interesting, that the original discussion about global strategic ICBM limitation and security was to protect the world against Iran, which he didn't really, they didn't talk about Iran. It didn't come up. I thought that was interesting too. He says the first eastward expansion of NATO is the Baltic states. That was not what they agreed to in Bucharest in 2008. He said Georgia and Ukraine were invited to join NATO. They didn't agree to that. He said unelected people direct the president, so it doesn't make much difference who's in charge. He talked about Yanukovych was not recognized by the United States as the elected leader, which he was. And then Yushchenko came to power, and so he tried to work with Yushchenko. He said the main concern of Russia here is that the EU is getting too close to flooding the Russian market with their goods without a boundary or a buffer, which Ukraine was, and Ukraine was a main trading partner before all this started to happen. And he was also concerned about NATO putting their bases basically on the Russian border. All of this conflict led to the 2014 Maidan Revolution, which the kids in Tbilisi in 2017 were very much aware of. They also said all their services were cut after that, that the Georgian government didn't have any way of replacing the services like electrical services and plumbing and sewage and bathrooms in the public schools. And all the infrastructure had been maintained by Russia, by the Soviets. And when they pulled out, that was taken, and nothing was maintained. And if you drove around in a taxi in Tbilisi in 2017, which was 3 years after Maidan, you could see like whole buildings falling apart and tenements and people living in shacks. And not the whole place was like that, but there were parts of neighborhoods that were like that. And it wasn't like a slum. It was just because of neglect. So hopefully they fixed that by now. I don't know. I don't have any connections there with Georgians any longer. I just went as a tourist. Anyway, so Putin says that before Maidan, there was tight cooperation between Russia and Ukraine, and he made a gesture like this, and that sort of implied to me that they had agreements, security agreements, not just trade agreements, but manufacturing parts for missiles, I don't know, airplanes, whatever they do, and now they can't do that because they're enemies. Let's see. He says that after Maidan, the previously close-knit relationship with Ukraine deteriorated as Ukraine began bombing Crimea and Donbass. And he said that prior to that, the UK, Germany, and France had guaranteed security. It's unclear. I don't know if he's referring to Minsk. I think it's what he's referring to. Before Maidan, and they just sort of threw that agreement away after Maidan. And He says basically the CIA ran a military coup and disposed of Yanukovych in 2014 with the Maidan Revolution, the Color Revolution. I think it's also called the Orange Revolution, perhaps. And then NATO military bases in Ukraine started appearing. That was not agreeable. And then he talked about Minsk, and he says that the EU and the USA never intended to implement this agreement, this Minsk agreement. It was simply a delay tactic, which I think Ursula von der Leyen said so, or one of the German EU leaders had said as much in the EU recently, that it was just, it might have been the German chancellor herself, the previous chancellor. I forget her name for some reason. Maybe it's blame it on Alzheimer's. It'll come to me anyway. So Putin says the Maidan Revolution cost the CIA $5 billion and political costs. The war started in 2014, he says, and we tried to stop it in 2022, so we didn't start it. And then, okay, now at about 5,400, I marked it. You can check that. Tucker says, have you achieved your aims? Putin says, no, we have not achieved our aims yet, because one of them is denazification. And this means the prohibition of all kinds of neo-Nazi movements. I think he means by law. I think that's the law in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. It certainly is here in Israel. Let's see, sorry. I'm using my water bottle as a stand there. I'm not very good at this. Okay, so Putin said Russia withdrew from Kyiv based on the agreement reached in Istanbul. As soon as Russia withdrew from Kyiv, NATO threw the agreement into the bin. I think he said snow or bin. He threw it out and prepared for war, leading to the present situation. Putin said, we have to denazify Ukraine. Well, it sounds a lot like Bibi saying we have to denazify Gaza, we have to denazify the PA, we have to denazify all the Palestinians, we have to re-educate a generation. I don't know who's going to do all that. It takes time, and who's going to do it? One person can't do it. It has to be legislated, and it has to be planned and agreed upon. I certainly agree with him on that. So anyway, he said earlier this year we discussed a denazification and in Istanbul. So I don't know if he means earlier this year in 2024, but that's what I heard him say earlier this year. I think he might mean earlier last year in 2023. He met in Istanbul with Zelensky, and they did discuss denazification. So at the 51 mark, Tucker asked Putin, what is denazification? And Putin goes on to say that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that's where my grandmother came from. My mother's mother came from Lithuania, and my mother's father was Russian, but I mean, they're Russian. He was a Russian Jew, but he was dark skinned. He looked like kind of North African, and my aunt was also dark skinned. And my mother and her mother were very light skinned, and they all had brown eyes. And I always wondered about all that. But anyway, my birth certificate says that she's my mother. And my father and I looked alike, and we both have the blue eyes, and I also looked a lot like him. I have pictures of him and when he was younger, and of myself as a baby. We looked alike. Anyway, so this is kind of personal history too for me. So he was saying, and I know this is true from what I did learn from my parents and from my own education so far, that the Ukrainians during World War II sided with Hitler, and they did Hitler's dirty work. And believing that Hitler would give them freedom, the Ukrainians were the ones that tortured and massacred and killed the Poles, the Jews, and the Russians in World War II. So that's why they left. That's why they were refugees. That's why they went to Chicago, and that's how I came to be 16 years later in Canoga Park, California. So Putin goes on to say Bandera and Shenkovich carried out Hitler's dirty work, exterminating Jews, Poles, and ethnic Russians during World War II. Putin said, "It is those people who were made the national heroes. That is the problem today in Ukraine. Those are the national heroes of Ukraine. These descendants of the Nazis who killed our ancestors." And Putin goes on to point out that there are seedlings of Nazism in other countries, like Canada, for instance. We try to uproot them as other countries. I would think that Israel is the main uprooter there from our foundation and today, and it's still going on. We try to uproot them as other countries do, but Ukraine does not. Ukraine treats them as national heroes with monuments and photos and puts their names on the flags, as it was displayed in Nazi Germany. The president of Ukraine stood up in the National Canadian Parliament and applauded a former SS officer who had exterminated Jews, Poles, Russians in World War II because he fought the Russians. So they were applauding this guy, and they showed a video clip of the Canadian Parliament standing up at a standing ovation for this former SS officer on the basis that he fought the Russians. The Russians are bad. And then, of course, later we remember what happened. There was a big fallout, and the last I read on X, Canadians are submitting a formal request to ask Trudeau to step down or to declare new elections, so they can get rid of him. Because he allowed this to happen, and I don't know anything more about Canadian politics than that. I didn't spend much time in Canada. It was cold, and it was cold in many ways. Okay, so now we're continuing on with answer to the question, how do you stop the fighting? Putin said after an hour and 6 minutes, 1:06:46. Sorry. I just need to rearrange my body here, okay. If you really want to stop the fighting, stop arming them. Stop supplying Ukraine with weapons. Which is the same thing Bibi's saying about Hamas, in my opinion. I think it's the same thing. Putin says if you stop arming them, the whole thing would be over in a few weeks. Tucker asked him, do you think NATO is worried about this becoming a nuclear conflict? Putin says that at least that's what they're talking about. And they're trying to intimidate their own populations with an imaginary Russian threat. This is an obvious fact. Thinking people understand perfectly well that this is a fake. They're trying to fuel the Russian threat. We would only send troops to Poland if Poland attacks Russia. It goes against common sense to get involved in any kind of a global war, and a global war will bring all of humanity to the brink of destruction. The fake threat of the fake Russian threat is a means to extract more taxes from the European and American taxpayers. The goal is to weaken Russia as much as possible. That's Putin's answer. Next question, Tucker says, what do you think of Chuck Schumer's statement yesterday that if we don't keep arming and funding Ukraine, that the American troops would have to fight in Europe? Putin says, it's a provocation and a cheap provocation at that. There are already mercenaries there from Poland, the United States, and Georgia. If the United States sends regular troops to the Ukraine, it certainly will bring humanity to the brink of a very serious conflict. Does the United States need this? What for? Thousands of miles separate us from your national territory. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, the national debt. This is still Putin answering, and the national debt is over 33 trillion US dollars. Don't you have anything better to do? So you should fight in the Ukraine. Wouldn't it be better to make an agreement with the Russians, knowing that Russia will fight for its interest until the end? Tucker says, then, the next question, there's no answer to that, is there? Priorities. Who blew up the Nord Stream? This is something they had a big laugh over. Putin says, smiling, you, for sure. Tucker says, smiling, well, I was busy that day. And they both laugh. And Tucker says, well, I didn't blow it up personally. Putin says, smiling, well, you personally might have an alibi, but the CIA has no such alibi. Tucker says, do you have evidence that the CIA or NATO did it? Putin says, well, I can't. After a pause, looking down, he says something like, I can't get into details, but without getting into any details, people always say, look for someone who's interested, who benefits. Chi bono, I don't know, something Latin or French phrase, who profits from it. In this case, says Putin, we should not only look for somebody who's interested, but somebody who has capabilities. Because there's many who are interested, but not very many people who are capable of sinking it to the bottom of the Baltic Sea and carrying out this explosion. These two components should be connected, who's interested and who is capable. He said that at the 1 hour, 12 minute, and 35 second mark. Okay, Tucker, next question. Why didn't you bring your evidence if you know who did it, basically, who blew up the Nord Stream? Then why didn't you bring your evidence to the world and win a propaganda war? Putin, laughing, says, because the U.S. controls the media. It's very difficult to win any kind of propaganda war. I'm going to try to get a little farther away from here. Let's see. It's tilted, so it always makes me look like I'm hugely fat, but I'm actually a little overweight now. I'm not obese anymore, according to the internet. A little shaky because I wanted to get my reflections, notes, and perceptions recorded before I do anything else today. For some reason, this seemed important, so I haven't taken my half a pill yet. And in fact, I haven't taken any pharma since, I don't know, about 12 hours. That was apropos nothing, except there's a little shake. That's the Parkinson's. Allegedly, I don't know about that either. If I sit in weird positions, I can stop it for a little, and then I have to shift again. So I think it's a spine thing. But I'm not a doctor, and the doctors don't know either anyway. Getting back to, Tucker says, how have U.S. sanctions affected the dollar's place in the world? Putin says to use the dollar, the U.S. dollar, as a tool of foreign policy struggle is one of the biggest strategic mistakes that the U.S. has made in its political leadership. Yeah, the thing is, if I don't read it before I forget what he said, I won't be able to read my own writing or understand my own notes. So this is what I used to do for a living, kind of for lawyers in the old days when I was the legal secretary. I would take notes and then type them as soon as I could so I wouldn't forget. And mostly it was recorded after that, and then they started typing their own stuff and I just edited it. So I'm just doing what I've been doing my whole life here, applying it to the news. So anyway, so the Tucker question was, how have U.S. sanctions affected the U.S. dollar's place in the world? Putin says that to use the dollar as a tool of foreign policy struggle is one of the biggest strategic mistakes that the U.S. political leadership has made. The dollar is the cornerstone of U.S. power. Inflation in the United States is minimal. It's about 3 or 3.4%, which is, I think, totally acceptable for the United States, but they won't stop printing. What does the debt of $33 trillion tell us? It's about emission. He said that, emission, at least that was the translation. And that was before I lost the captions. So he didn't say spending, he said emission. It's a curious choice of words, in my opinion. Somebody should ask, what does he mean by that exactly? And is that, what's the Russian word? I don't know. I know like 5 Russian words. So that's not one of them. Nevertheless, it is the main weapon, the dollar is, used by the United States to preserve its power across the world. As soon as the political leadership decided to use the US dollar as a tool of political struggle, a blow was dealt to this American power, Putin says. Look at what is going on now in the world. Even the United States allies are downsizing their dollar reserves, seeing as everybody is looking for ways to protect themselves. The fact that the US places restrictions on certain countries, such as freezing assets, restraining transactions. He's talking about SWIFT, and he's talking about the latest EU schemes to freeze or seize Russian assets in order to give them to the Ukraine to fund the endless war. And he's also referring to, I think, ridiculous laws that the EU has passed about Russians can't drive across the border anymore in their own cars, or they can't take toilet paper, or there's just ridiculous rules that just target Russians and single them out. That's been going on for 2 years now, basically. Until 2022, says Putin, 80% of the foreign trade was made in euros and dollars, and our trade, meaning Russia, was 50% US dollars. So all these restrictions on SWIFT and freezing assets and seizing assets and putting restrictions on people that trade with Russia has caused great concern. All these sanctions have caused great concern, says Putin, and sends a signal to the whole world. Now the US dollar transactions with Russia are down to 13% from previous 50% before the war 2 years ago. This was a US decision. 3% before the war he's talking about was in yuan, and today is 34% yuan and 34% rubles. So the transition from USD to yuan and rubles are strengthened, and the dollar is being killed, he said, by your own hands, looking at Tucker. Meaning we're doing it to ourselves. The dollar is committing suicide, is what he's saying. Okay, so then Tucker asked, Putin, do you worry about the Chinese economy completely dominating BRICS and becoming the new colonial power? So you don't like the dollar anymore, you don't believe in the dollar, so is the yuan going to be any better because they're taking over, in other words? And Putin says, we've heard those boogeyman stories before. It's a boogeyman story. We're the neighbors with China. There are neighbors. You can't choose your neighbors just as you cannot choose close relatives. We share a border of 1,000 kilometers with them, meaning China. This is the first thing. Second, we have centuries-long tradition of coexistence with China and Russia. Third thing, China's foreign policy is not aggressive. They always compromise. That I don't know. I don't have centuries-long history with China, but I don't know. Let's see. Putin said before, referring to the East and West and comparing it to the two hemispheres of the brain, that there's two hemispheres and each one does something that's a little more specialized, but in the end, they have to function as one brain. And when they don't, it's kind of like a disease that you have to heal. And he's trying to heal it. And one of the ways that he's trying to heal it is with this interview. Putin said that the last goal of creating $200 billion worth of trade between Russia and China was exceeded. Apparently last year it was $230 billion, and according to the Chinese, it was $240 billion. And that is, he says, well-balanced, high-tech science research. And I don't know what else. He didn't elaborate. Putin says the BRICS nations are developing rapidly. In 1992, BRICS was 16% of world trade, and now it's 42% of global trade. And this exceeds the G7 share of global trade, which was 47%, and now it's about 30% of the global market. Due to trends in global economy, BRICS in 2024 now have a greater share of the global economy than the G7 nations do. This has nothing to do with Ukraine, says Putin. This is inevitable. It's like the rise of the sun. You cannot prevent the sun from rising. Reference to the East, Asia, I guess. You have to adapt to it. How does the U.S. adapt? With force, bombs, sanctions. This is about I gotta read my own writing. Consent. I don't know what that word is. This is about, I think he meant, it's about the overall adaptation attitude towards the changing tide in the global economy. It's not about a particular leader. In purchasing power, China overtook the United States a long time ago. Let's see, 1.5 billion people in China. The dollar is the tool the U.S. uses. It doesn't work anymore. Russia is the most restricted nation in the world. Okay, so that was his answer to that. Then Tucker says, who's in charge of the U.S.? Putin says, it's a good question. He goes on to describe a failed collective West plan of breaking Russia up and weakening Russia. Putin tries to answer the question of who's in charge in the U.S. He says it's complicated. And he says Russians have a different system, and it's not electoral college, and it's different. Let's see. Putin made a reference to Indonesia becoming a world economy. It's interesting that he mentions Indonesia and he doesn't mention India or Iran or anything about the Middle East or Africa. He didn't say a word about Africa either. Didn't say anything about the Red Sea. Putin said that combining Western forces against China is a mistake. Said at one point, why don't you just talk to them? Despite all the problems, the U.S. general GDP, gross national product, gross domestic product, is growing by 2.5%. He says it's not so bad. But if we want to ensure our own futures, we need to change our approach. The only question is how this is going to happen, slowly and gently or painfully. Tucker asked Putin, did the U.S. provoke you? Did the U.S. provoke Russia into this war? And Putin said the neo-Nazis started basically a race war in 2014, and NATO bases in Ukraine didn't help. And it didn't help that the Ukrainians have gotten into, they kind of basically turned it into a race thing. Like he was talking about non-titular nationality. And I don't know what that means, I have to look it up. But again, it's a translation from Russian. I don't know what the Russian words were. I think that I've read some stuff about Ukrainians saying Russians are not, they're not true Slavic, or they're not Nordic, or they're not white enough, or something like that. It's a racial slur to imply that Russians are Mongols. I think they said it's something like that. It's like calling Jews dirty names or anything else that you might say about your neighbor that doesn't look exactly like you, that makes them worse than you, to justify aggression. But he's basically saying that's not the whole thing, but that's not helping. They're neo-Nazis. They're racist, and they're aggressive, and they're militant, and that's what provoked us. And it started in 2014. So Tucker says next question, Tucker says, do you think Zelensky has the freedom, the latitude to negotiate a settlement, a peace settlement to this conflict? Putin says, I don't know, he used to. And so Putin says, I met with him and I said to him, Volodya, why are you supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine when your father fought against fascism? And he ran himself on a peace platform. Zelensky in Ukraine won the election based on his promising peace with Russia. What happened was the opposite, and he deceived his voters, the people of the Ukraine, by doing the opposite. And Tucker said, why? And Putin said, because it's kind of hard to clash with aggressive neo-Nazis. You never know what they're going to do. And that the nationalists are being, nationalists meaning the neo-Nazis, that he calls neo-Nazis, are being supported by the collective West. And Zelensky's hands are tied, basically, is what he's saying. And he's also kind of implying that Zelensky doesn't have the courage, the chutzpah, or the whatever, the moxie to stand up to the collective West, and namely to the neo-Nazis in his own country, to take over and make a deal and stop. And so Putin says, why can't he? He can. I don't know. He can if he can. Why not is a good question. So then Putin says, we had an agreement in Istanbul, and then Boris Johnson came along and stopped it after the Ukrainians signed. So the United Kingdom came along and put a stop to the Ukrainians after the Ukrainians had already agreed in Istanbul to peace, at least a ceasefire in Ukraine with the war that's going on now. And this happened, I don't know, a year ago at least. So Russia has never refused to peace talks, and why did Boris Johnson do that? And the only answer that Putin gave was arrogance. And that was at about an hour and 41 minutes and 51 seconds he said that. Then Tucker asked Putin, what does being a Christian leader mean to you? And Putin said something about the soul, Russian soul is in the heart, and I don't know. You gotta listen to that part yourself. I can't answer because I'm not a Christian. And then there was some discussion about this guy Gerskowicz. I don't know anything about him. Apparently he was arrested for espionage, and they want to trade him for someone, and they're open to talking about it, but they're not going to send him back with Tucker. And As far as the war in Ukraine goes, he said, Putin says they need an off-ramp, meaning the collective West needs an off-ramp, and it's not up to him. And when they get their act together, they can call him and let him know what their plan is. And that was all I got out of it. And I will upload this, and I don't know how to edit it, so it's not edited, but that's what I thought about everything. And so, good morning from Akko, and Shabbat Shalom.